Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something maybe deceptively simple. Why exactly are there three spatial dimensions? I mean, we live in it. It feels completely obvious, right? Like the ground under our feet.
It does. It's so fundamental, we barely question it. But you're right. The moment you stop taking three for granted and ask why that number,
Okay.
well, you've opened up this enormous puzzle about how reality is actually put together.
Yeah, and it's a puzzle that's stumped people for ages.
Oh, absolutely. Philosophers, physicists,
Mm-hmm.
they've circled around it for centuries. We got pretty good at describing that 3D works. It allows for stable orbits, stable atoms, all that crucial stuff.
Right.
But a convincing mechanism for why it arises in the first place, that's been much harder to pin down. It often just gets treated as a given, like a rule you start with, not an outcome you explain.
Which is precisely why we're doing this deep dive today. We're looking into the Unified Coherence Theory, or UCT, from Philip Lillian. And the sources suggest it offers a really radical reframing.
It really does.
UCT basically says, stop treating 3D as some fixed axiom. Instead, think of it as a dynamic balance point, a kind of a coherence problem, as the sources put it.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to really unpack that idea. Is our 3D world the dimensional sweet spot for stability and complexity?
That's the core thesis.
Yeah.
And to get there, we need to grapple with some pretty deep concepts from the sources. We'll explore this idea of a 3D stability plateau.
Okay.
We'll use a really powerful analogy, the fluid dynamics one, looking at the Navier-Stokes equations to sort of illustrate why 3D seems uniquely stable.
Sounds helpful. Analogies are good here.
They really are. And then, crucially, we need to investigate the mechanism UCT proposes for where all the interesting stuff, all the complexity comes from, this concept called dimensional bleeding.
Dimensional bleeding. Okay, that sounds intriguing. Let's dig in. All right, maybe we should start with the history, just briefly, because it really highlights the gap UCT is trying to fill.
Good idea. Because for a very long time, dimensionality wasn't really a physics question, was it? It was more philosophical.
Like Aristotle, assuming it's just the nature of space, part of its definition.
Exactly. Taken as a given. And even much later, with mathematicians like Riemann, who started treating geometry as something physical, something you could potentially measure.
They still weren't really deriving the number 3 from first principles. It was more about exploring the possibilities of different geometries.
Precisely. The breakthroughs that came later, the ones physicists usually point to, established constraints. They told us what dimensions allow for the universe we see, but not why the universe ended up with those dimensions.
Okay, so let's quickly touch on those key constraints, because they're important background. You mentioned Kant.
Right, Immanuel Kant.
Mm-hmm.
His argument was more, well, metaphysical, or perhaps epistemological. He argued that our minds are basically structured to perceive in 3 dimensions. It's a necessary condition for us to even have experiences the way we do.
So it's about the observer, in a sense.
In a sense, yes. You can't really intuitively grasp or navigate a world that isn't 3D. It's baked into how we interact with reality.
But then came the more, let's say, hard physics constraints. Paul Ehrenfest's work is usually the big one cited here, right?
Absolutely. Ehrenfest's work in the early 20th century was crucial. He showed mathematically that if you changed the number of spatial dimensions away from 3, the fundamental force laws like gravity and electromagnetism, they break down in terms of stability.
How so? What happened?
Take gravity. In 4 or more spatial dimensions, the inverse square law becomes something else, like an inverse cube law or higher. And the consequence, stable orbits, like planets around a star, become impossible.
Ah, right.
Any tiny nudge, any perturbation, and an object would either spiral away to infinity or plunge directly into the central body. No stable solar systems.
And that instability carries over to the quantum level, too, affecting atoms.
It does, critically. The stability of atoms, the way electrons form stable orbitals or shells around a nucleus, that also depends delicately on the 3D nature of space and the inverse square law for electromagnetism. Change the dimensions, and those stable electron configurations, the very foundation of chemistry, they can't exist. So no molecules, no complex matter.
Basically, no chemistry, which means no life, no planets as we know them.
Pretty much. It's a powerful constraint. And then you have thinkers like Max Tegmark, who later brought in the anthropic principle.
Which basically says,
well, simplifying it a bit, it says we observe the universe to be 3 + 1 dimensional, 3 space, 1 time. Because if it were any other way, the conditions for stable structures, complexity, and ultimately life and conscious observers like us wouldn't exist.
so we see 3D because it's the only dimension we could see.
That's the essence of it. It explains why we don't find ourselves in a 2D or 4D universe.
Oh.
Those arguments are strong. They establish necessary conditions.
And this is the key point. They don't explain the origin. They don't give us the engine that actually produced 3 dimensions. It's still treated as a parameter that just happens to be right for us.
Precisely. They describe the what works, but not the why it emerged. And that's the gap UCT aims to fill.
By saying dimensionality isn't a fixed background parameter at all.
Exactly. UCT's core idea is that dimensionality itself emerges. It's a dynamic process, an equilibrium point that the universe settles into.
And this equilibrium is defined in terms of coherence. Why that word? What does coherence mean in this context?
Coherence within UCT is really fundamental. It represents the universe's capacity to maintain structure, to hold forms together, to have sustained patterns. Think of it as structural integrity or potential.
Okay.
The theory posits that the universe exists in this constant interplay, this continuum between perfect coherence, which would be totally static, frozen, unchanging structure, and perfect decoherence, which is complete chaos, fragmentation, no structure at all.
Like total order versus total randomness.
Kind of, yes. And UCT claims that 3 dimensions represents the unique sweet spot. It's the dimensional state where the universe can maintain a high degree of coherence, enough to hold things together stably.
Right, like atoms and planet.
But without becoming completely rigid or frozen, like a lower dimensional system might. And crucially, it also allows for enough asymmetry and dynamic change to happen without the whole thing just falling apart into chaos, like a higher dimensional system would.
So 3D is stable enough to persist, but flexible enough to evolve.
That's the idea. It hits the perfect balance. It allows things to be and things to become.
Which leads to that specific UCT terminology. What was it? The equilibrium plateau.
Yes, the equilibrium plateau, where the coherence gradient of the universe stabilizes during hyperfractal dimensional emergence. It's a mouthful, but
Let's break that down. Hyperfractal dimensional emergence. Does that mean dimensions don't just pop into existence as integers like 1, 2, 3?
that's the implication. It suggests a more continuous, perhaps fractional process initially, where the universe is exploring different degrees of freedom. And these integer dimensions, like 3, are stable resonance points where the system naturally settles.
Like finding a natural frequency.
Kind of like that, yeah. 3 dimensions is the first major stable resonance where complex dynamic structures become sustainable. It's an outcome, selected by this drive for balanced coherence, not just a preset rule.
Okay, that's still quite abstract, this idea of coherence gradients and stabilization. The sources use an analogy to make it more concrete, right? Fluid dynamics.
Yes, and it's a really illuminating one. UCT points to the behavior of fluids, specifically governed by the Navier-Stokes equations, as a kind of physical parable for this dimensional selection principle. The source calls it an extraordinary window into why 3D might be special.
Why fluids? What's the connection?
Well, fluid dynamics is all about how structures emerge and behave within a continuous medium. Things like vortices, turbulence, stable currents. It's about self-organization based on underlying physical laws.
Okay, makes sense.
So the idea is, let's look at how fluids behave if we hypothetically confine them to different dimensions. Does one dimension allow for richer, more stable, more interesting dynamics than others?
All right, let's start low. What happens in a 2D fluid?
In 2 dimensions, things get weirdly rigid.
Yeah.
The physics leads to what's called an inverse energy cascade.
Inverse cascade. Normally, energy flows down, right? Big eddies break into smaller ones, and eventually it just dissipates as heat.
Exactly. That's our everyday 3D experience. Turbulence breaks down. But in 2D, due to certain conserved quantities like entropy, basically the square of the fluid spin, the energy flow reverses.
So, small swirls merge into bigger ones.
Yes. Instead of breaking down, small vortices tend to merge and form larger, incredibly stable, coherent structures. The energy flows upwards towards larger scales.
What's the end result of that if everything keeps merging?
You end up with a system dominated by these huge, long-lasting vortices. Think of Jupiter's Great Red Spot. That's a classic example of quasi-2D fluid dynamics, producing a structure that lasts for centuries. In a purely 2D universe, the prediction is that the flow would eventually lock up into a kind of static, almost crystalline pattern of giant vortices. It's very stable, very coherent, but there's very little room for change or complex evolution. It's too ordered, too symmetric. The source calls it static oversimetry.
Okay, stable but boring, basically.
Creatively stunted, absolutely. Now let's jump to the other end. What about 4 or more spatial dimensions, 40 plus? Surely more dimensions mean more freedom, more possibilities.
You'd think so, more room to move.
It does mean more freedom, but that becomes the problem. It leads to hyperdecoherence, fragmentation. The key concept here is vorticity, the spin, the rotation that holds structures like vortices or even storm systems together.
Okay.
In our 3D world, vorticity has a crucial property called self-stretching. A vortex, like a smoke ring, can kind of pull on itself, stretch itself out along its axis, and this process actually intensifies its spin, helping it resist decay. It helps it maintain its structure.
Right, it can reinforce itself.
Exactly. But in 4D or higher, those extra spatial dimensions provide too many directions for the energy and angular momentum to, will leak away. The vortex loses that ability to effectively stretch and sustain itself. It becomes too diffuse.
So it can't hold itself together.
Pretty much. Any structure that starts to form based on rotation just fragments almost immediately. It dissolves into incoherence because the energy dissipates too quickly in all those extra directions. You get a complete loss of stable structure.
It's too chaotic, the opposite problem of 2D.
Precisely.
Yeah.
40 plus is too unstable, too transient to build anything complex or lasting.
So 2D is overconstrained, 4D plus is underconstrained. Which brings us back to 3 dimensions, the Goldilocks dimension, according to this analogy.
That's exactly how UCT presents it, using the fluid dynamics parable. In 3D, you get this perfect dynamic balance.
How does that balance work?
It balances two key things. First, you still have vortex stretching. That provides the necessary element of instability, of chaos, of turbulence. It keeps the system dynamic and prevents it from freezing up like the 2D case.
That's the engine for change, for new patterns.
Right. And this is crucial, this tendency towards chaos is perfectly regulated in 3D by dissipation. Viscosity, friction, whatever the mechanism, it works effectively to drain energy out of the smallest scales, preventing the turbulence from running away and fragmenting everything, like in 4D.
So energy cascades down to small scales and dissipates like we expect?
Yes, and that downward cascade of energy allows stable, complex structures to emerge and persist at larger scales. You get both stability and dynamism.
It's really compelling when you put it like that.
It is. The Navier-Stokes analogy strongly suggests that 3D is this unique dimensional regime, the coherence resonance plateau, where you have just the right amount of freedom and just the right amount of constraint for stable yet creative structures to exist. It's dynamically optimal.
Okay, the fluid analogy provides a great intuition. But let's get back to the core UCT theory. How does it formalize this idea mathematically? How does it derive 2D33 as special from its own principles beyond the analogy?
Right, the analogy is just that, an analogy. To make the claim rigorous within its own framework, UCT needs a way to quantify this notion of structural potential across different dimensions.
Okay.
And it does this using something called the coherence density function, symbolized as lambda text. So you can think of lambda text as a mathematical measure of how much stable, complex structure a universe with a given dimensionality, dollar, can support.
So it's like a score for how structurally fit a dimension is.
That's a good way to put it, yes. Higher lambda text means more potential for stable complexity. Now, the crucial claim of UCT is that this function, lambda text, reaches its maximum value precisely at D33 out of free.
It peaks at 3 dimensions.
Exactly. And mathematically, a peak or maximum occurs where the rate of change, the derivative, is 0. So UCT defines the stability of TT out of 3 to 3 by this condition. Frag D lambda specifically when D at E leaves 3 tall.
What does that 0 rate of change mean conceptually? Why is that the sweet spot?
It means that at T3 the system finds its optimal balance point. If you try to move slightly away from 3, say, towards 2.9 or 3.1 in this conceptual hyperfractal sense, the coherence density, the potential for stable structure, immediately starts to decrease. If you move towards D22, lambda text drops because, as the analogy suggested, the system becomes too rigid, losing dynamic potential. If you move towards D22, lambda text even more sharply because the system loses coherence altogether, becoming too fragmented.
So T233 is like the top of a hill. Any step away, you go downhill in terms of structural potential.
Precisely. Or think of it like a valley bottom in terms of stability. It's the point everything naturally settles into. It acts as a dimensional attractor. Other dimensional configurations are inherently less stable and would tend to either rigidify or fragment, effectively collapsing towards this T233 equilibrium.
So this point, T233 achieves what UCT calls stable flow symmetry.
Yes, it's stable, Because it can hold persistent forms together. It has flow because it's dynamic enough to allow change, evolution, and information processing. And it's a symmetry in the sense that it represents this fundamental balance point in the universe's structure. It's the dimension where self-organization works best.
So if we visualize that curve you mentioned, plotting lambda against dollar, it would go up, peak sharply at d beat h3, and then fall off rapidly.
That's the conceptual picture. Approaching from below, say near DT22, coherence is high, but rising toward the peak it's dominating, leading to that over-confinement, the static order.
Too much structure, not enough change.
Right. Then you hit T2002, the absolute maximum, maximal coherence that also supports dynamic resonance and change, the optimum point.
And then moving past 3, towards DF42.
The curve plummets. Decoherence takes over very quickly. The potential for stable structure collapses. It's too spread out, too unstable.
So the mathematical formalism reinforces the analogous conclusion. The D332 isn't arbitrary. It's the derived optimum for maximizing stable dynamic structure based on this fundamental concept of coherence.
That's the core argument. Yeah. It attempts to elevate the number 3 from a mere observation or anthropic necessity to a mathematical consequence of a deeper principle governing structural potential. The 3D stability plateau is framed as the universe's first great symmetry break, establishing the stable arena needed for everything else.
Okay, if 3D is this perfect stability plateau, this equilibrium, that sounds almost static. But our universe is constantly churning out new, complex things: turbulence, life, evolution, galaxies forming. How does UCT account for this constant emergence if 3D is supposedly the stable endpoint?
That is a fantastic question, and it leads directly to what might be the most speculative but also maybe the most interesting part of UCT, the concept of dimensional bleeding. The theory argues that while the 3D plateau provides the fundamental stability, it's not a completely sealed-off system. The engine driving ongoing complexity, novelty, and self-organization is proposed to be a subtle, controlled influx of, let's call it influence, or structural potential from adjacent higher dimensions, primarily the fourth dimension.
Whoa, okay, so we're not talking about a whole fourth spatial dimension suddenly appearing, right? Because Ehrenfest told us that would destabilize everything.
Exactly right. It's crucial to understand it's not proposing an extra spatial direction you can point in. That would violate the stability we just established. Instead, the sources describe it as something much more subtle. Nested curvature modulations and torsional resonances embedded within our 3D fields.
Okay. Nested curvature modulations, torsional resonances. Can we unpack that a bit? What might that actually look like or mean physically?
Think of it like this. Imagine our 3D space is the surface of a very calm lake. That's the stability plateau. Dimensional bleeding isn't like opening a door to walk into a fourth room. It's more like subtle, complex ripples or currents within the lake water itself, patterns that are influenced by or are residuals of 4D physics, but they manifest only as complex disturbances in 3D.
So tiny warps or twists within space itself.
Kind of. Nested curvature modulations might mean slight, almost undetectable variations in the geometry of space at very small scales, or perhaps within force fields. Torsional resonances suggest lingering effects of higher dimensional twisting motions, which can't fully express themselves in 3D, but leave behind a kind of energetic or informational residue that introduces asymmetry.
Okay, so it's like a subtle flavor of 4D physics leaking into 3D.
That's a decent way to think about it. It provides the necessary grit or perturbation that allows stable 3D structures to self-organize in complex ways, rather than just remaining static.
How does this leakage actually happen? Is there a proposed mechanism for how 4D influence couples to our 3D reality?
UCT proposes it happens via something called hyperfractal coupling. Mathematically, it's described as a nonlinear resonance between the coherence tensors of adjacent dimensions. Let's say MathCal 3D describes coherence in 3D, and MathCal describes it in 4D. There's a subtle interaction, a resonance between them.
Okay, a tensor. That's just a way to describe something that has different values depending on direction, right? Like stress in a material.
Exactly. So coherence isn't just a single number. It has directional properties described by these tensors. The idea is that the 4D coherence tensor can subtly influence or excite the 3D coherence tensor at their interface, causing these modulations.
The source used an analogy here too, didn't it? Like light refraction.
Yes, that's a helpful one. Imagine light passing from air into water. Yeah. Bends, changes speed, its properties are modulated by the new medium, but the light itself doesn't become water. Similarly, the 4D coherence potential refracts as it enters the 3D regime, expressing itself not as a full dimension, but as localized energy, information, or structural complexity within 3D.
And this refracted influence is quantified as the coherence gradient leakage Shasty card.
Correct. Haiti text bleed represents the local flux, the amount of this higher dimensional coherence potential seeping into a particular region of 3D space per unit time.
And the key implication
The
is,
key implication is that regions with a non-zero text bleed are identified as zones of increased emergence. Wherever this bleeding is happening, that's where you expect to see enhanced self-organization, novelty, and the formation of complex structures.
so the more bleed, the more potential for complexity.
Well, up to a point, this is where the coherence complexity function math goal comes in. UCT formalizes complexity as being dependent on both the stability of the 3D plateau and this bleeding flux, peace plaques.
And it's not just more bleed equals more complexity.
No, it's another Goldilocks situation. Maximum complexity, according to MathCal, arises where the bleed is small but non-zero. If Fictec's bleed is too large, it overwhelms the 3D stability, leading back towards 4D-style fragmentation and chaos.
No.
If Fictec's bleed is zero, you get the stable but static 3D plateau with no engine for new complexity.
So you need just a trickle, a subtle instability to drive creativity without destroying the underlying order.
Exactly. It's described beautifully in the sources as the coherence breathing zone. The universe, primarily our 3D part of it, is constantly inhaling a bit of this raw, structural potential, pure coherence from higher dimensions.
And exhaling it as structure diversity, as complexity, as information within 3D.
Precisely. This subtle leakage, this hyperfractal resonance drift, is posited as the fundamental engine behind evolution, morphogenesis, and maybe even cognition.
Let's look at those manifestations. That really grounds the idea. Cosmology, for instance. How would this 4D bleed show up in the large-scale structure of the universe?
UCT suggests it's responsible for the lumpiness, the structured irregularity we see. Instead of being perfectly smooth, the universe organized into the cosmic web, vast filaments and clusters of galaxies, with voids in between. This nonlinear structure isn't just gravity acting on initial density fluctuations.
It's influenced by this underlying bleed.
Yes. The idea is that the initial quantum fluctuations themselves might have been coupled to the 4D coherence tensor, and this ongoing subtle modulation from 4D continues to guide large-scale structure formation, creating that intricate web-like pattern. It provides the template for complexity on the grandest scales.
Fascinating. Okay, down to the scale of life. Biology and morphogenesis, how organisms develop their complex shapes. How does the bleed play a role there?
Here, the higher-order coherence is seen as providing the form potential, or the morphogenetic field that guides development. It's not just the genetic code. There's this background coherence flux that modulates the biochemical networks, guiding the self-organization process so that cells differentiate and arrange themselves into functional, complex, adaptive shapes.
So it helps explain how you get reliable, complex forms from seemingly simple starting points.
That's the idea. It provides a source of organizing information beyond just the DNA. And adaptive intelligence, in this view, could be related to how efficiently a biological system taps into and utilizes this coherence flux to respond and restructure itself.
And the most abstract connection, consciousness and intuition. How is that linked to 4D resonance?
This is definitely the most speculative area, but UCT proposes that moments of deep intuition, sudden insight, or aha moments might represent instances where consciousness briefly achieves a stronger resonance with this underlying 4D coherence field.
Like tapping into a deeper layer of potential information.
Something like that. Accessing structural potential or information that hasn't yet been filtered or fully processed through the standard pathways of 3D logic and perception. It's like a momentary controlled leak of insight directly from this adjacent dimensional potential.
Wow. So from galaxies to thoughts, this dimensional bleeding is proposed as the universal engine of creativity.
That's the picture UCT paints. It's the interface where stable reality meets the potential for novelty.
Okay, we have this stable 3D plateau and this subtle bleeding from 4D driving complexity. This whole system sounds intricate. Is there an overarching law governing this exchange, something keeping it all balanced?
Yes, according to UCT, there has to be. And this is where the conservation of coherence principle, or CCP, comes in. It's presented as perhaps the most fundamental law governing these dimensional dynamics.
Conservation of coherence, similar to conservation of energy.
Exactly. Analogous in status, but potentially even more fundamental within this framework. The CCP states, quite simply, that the total amount of coherence in the entire universe across all dimensions, in all its forms, remains constant. It cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed or redistributed.
That's a huge claim. It elevates coherence to this primary conserved quantity.
It really does.
Hmm.
It implies that coherence isn't just a property of systems, it's a fundamental currency of reality. Just like energy can change forms, kinetic, potential, thermal, coherence can change its mode of expression.
How so? What are its forms?
UCT suggests that in higher dimensions, like
Hmm.
4D plus, coherence exists in a pure state, raw, undifferentiated structural potential. When it stabilizes onto the 3D plateau, it becomes dynamic coherence, capable of supporting both stability and change. And when it manifests as complexity via dimensional bleeding, it transforms into emergent coherence expressed as information, structure, organization.
But the total amount summed across all these forms and dimensions never changes.
Correct. Mathematically, this is expressed by saying the integral of the coherence density, so the entire relevant domain, symbolized by omega representing the whole dimensional structure, is constant over time. So, frag v r, the books must always balance.
And this conservation law is what drives the dimensional bleeding. It forces the exchange.
Precisely. The CCP enforces the coherence breathing mechanism we talked about. The system must exchange coherence between dimensions to maintain this overall balance.
So the inflow from 4D must balance the expression into 3D complexity.
Exactly. The influx of pure structural potential from 4D or fan de bleed carries coherence into the 3D system. To maintain the overall conservation, the 3D system must then process or transform this coherence into emergent structures, complexity, information, effectively binding it or expressing it locally. The transformation changes the form of coherence, but not the total amount.
So the complexity we see, life, galaxies, turbulence, is actually a necessary consequence of the universe needing to balance its coherence budget across dimensions.
That's the profound implication. It's not just something that can happen in 3D, it's something that must happen to satisfy the CCP. The source material gives a specific equation for how 3D coherence changes locally. Fran is at 4D and 3D.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It means the rate at which the coherence density changes at a specific point in 3D space, fractional lambda, is directly determined by how much coherence is flowing into or out of that point from the 4D bleed. If there's a net inflow of coherence, positive bleed, the local 3D coherence must change often by forming structure to accommodate it and keep the total balanced.
So local emergence is directly driven by this transdimensional flux, mandated by conservation.
Yes, and this view, if correct, really does place coherence at a level more fundamental than even energy in classical physics.
How does it redefine things like energy and entropy?
Within the UCT framework, energy itself is seen as a manifestation of coherence differentiation. Think of it like ripples or oscillations on the surface of the underlying coherence field. It's how changes in coherence manifest dynamically.
And entropy, the tendency towards disorder.
Entropy is interpreted as coherence dispersion. It's the natural tendency for concentrated, structured coherence to spread out, becoming more uniform and less capable of doing work or holding complex form. It's coherence losing its structural potential locally.
And the opposite order, life, information, what UCT calls negentropy.
That's seen as coherence restoration or concentration. It's the process, driven by the influx of potential via dimensional bleeding, where coherence becomes locally organized, structured, and information-rich, seemingly defying the usual trend towards dispersion.
So all physical phenomena, energy flow, increasing entropy, the emergence of life, are just different facets of how the universe manages and conserves its total coherence across different dimensional expressions.
That's the grand picture painted by UCT and the CCP. The entire cosmos is viewed as this vast dynamic system, constantly reorganizing its coherence, using the 3D plateau as the primary stage for transformation, all under the strict rule of conservation. Complexity isn't an anomaly, it's the universe breathing.
It's a fundamentally different way of looking at, well, everything.
It absolutely is. It aims to provide a unified framework based on this principle of coherence. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Right. So let's try to pull this all together. What's the big takeaway from this deep dive into unified coherence theory?
I think the core message is that our seemingly ordinary three-dimensional world isn't just an accident or a backdrop. According to UCT, it's a result. It's the optimal solution, the coherent middle way emerging from a fundamental interplay between structure and chaos.
It's the dimensional sweet spot, stable enough to hold things together, but porous enough, thanks to this dimensional bleeding, to allow for constant novelty and complexity.
Exactly. And that complexity isn't random noise. It's portrayed as a structured, almost necessary consequence of the universe maintaining its overall coherence balance across dimensions. It's resonance drift made manifest.
The universe needs to conserve coherence, and the way it does that in our vicinity is by using 3D as the platform to transform pure potential from 4D into the complex structures we see.
That's the synthesis. The conservation of coherence principle is the engine. 3D is the optimal stage. And dimensional bleeding is the subtle mechanism driving the continuous performance of emergence and evolution.
So for you listening, the next time you see something incredibly complex and self-organizing, maybe it's turbulence patterns in a stream, the intricate structure of a snowflake, the way life adapts, or even just that flash of intuition that seems to come out of the blue.
UCT would suggest you're potentially seeing the fingerprints of that dimensional bleeding. The residual influence, the hyperfractal leakage from a higher dimensional potential, subtly shaping and driving creativity within our 3D reality.
It connects the very small to the very large, the physical to potentially the mental.
It aims for that level of unification.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with a really provocative final thought to chew on.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, if complexity and the potential for evolution are formally linked to this dimensional bleeding flux, could we, in theory, measure it? Could Fertich's bleed become a predictive metric?
Meaning, predicting how likely something is to evolve or change.
Potentially. Could measuring the local bleed rate tell us something about the evolutionary potential of a biological system, the likelihood of a phase transition in a material, or even the potential for further structure formation in a region of the cosmos? Is emergence predictable if we understand its dimensional fuel source?
That is a fascinating question. A potential new way to quantify the capacity for change itself. Definitely something to mull over.
Indeed.
All right, that feels like a good place to wrap up this exploration. Thank you for diving into these complex but truly mind-bending sources with us.
A pleasure. It's powerful material.
Until the next deep dive, keep questioning the obvious.